December chapter 5th, 1941. Moscow's outer suburbs. The temperature had fallen to 38 degrees below zero. Snow fell in dense curtains across the frozen wasteland that stretched between the German forward positions and the spires of the Kremlin, visible now only as dark silhouettes against a pewter sky. Oberleutnant Karl Heinz Weber crouched in a foxhole carved from earth so hard it rang like steel when struck with a shovel. His breath crystallized instantly in the air. Around him, men wrapped in blankets and newspapers huddled against frostbite that had already claimed more casualties than Soviet bullets. Weber held in his numb fingers a small iron cross he'd carried since Poland, a talisman that had seen him through France, through Yugoslavia, through the summer roads of Ukraine. Now it felt cold and foreign in his palm, like everything else in this frozen hell. Behind him, the order had just arrived by field telephone. Halt! Dig in! No retreat under any circumstances. By order of the Führer. Weber looked at his men, hollow-eyed, shivering, some already showing the black patches of frostbite on their cheeks and fingers. They had marched 3,000 kilometers to reach this point. Moscow was 15 kilometers away. 15 kilometers from the greatest prize, from the culmination of everything they'd been promised. And now they were ordered to stop, to hold, to freeze in place while the Soviet counteroffensive, which had begun just hours before, gathered momentum like an avalanche. The Iron Cross slipped from his frozen fingers into the snow. He did not pick it up. To understand how millions of German soldiers came to die not in glorious battle, but in obedience to a madman's refusal to yield ground, one must return to a moment when that refusal first crystallized into doctrine. The winter of 1941-1942 was not merely a military crisis. It was the crucible in which Adolf Hitler transformed from politician warlord into something far more dangerous. A fanatic who believed his will alone could alter reality. The German Wehrmacht that invaded the Soviet Union on June the 22nd, 1941, was the most formidable military machine the world had ever seen. Operation Barbarossa deployed 3.8 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, 600,000 motor vehicles, and 750,000 horses across an 1,800-mile front. Behind them lay the conquered territories of Poland, France, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Yugoslavia, and Greece. German military doctrine, blitzkrieg, had revolutionized warfare. Speed, shock, encirclement. The panzer divisions drove deep into enemy territory while infantry mopped up the surrounded pockets. It had worked everywhere. France, which held out for 4 years in the Great War, fell in 6 weeks. But the Soviet Union was not France. By early December 1941, the advance had stalled. German supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of primitive roads that turned to impassable mud in autumn and froze into rutted iron in winter. Tanks designed for European roads broke down on Russian steppes. Horses starved. Men wore summer uniforms because the High Command had calculated the war would be over before winter. The calculation was wrong. On December 5th, Soviet General Georgy Zhukov launched a massive counteroffensive with 100 divisions. Fresh troops from Siberia, equipped for winter warfare, wearing quilted jackets and felt boots while German soldiers wrapped their feet in newspaper and burned furniture to stay alive. The Wehrmacht reeled backward. Panic spread through units that had never known defeat. Officers requested permission to retreat to defensible positions, to shorten supply lines, to regroup. Hitler refused. On December 16, 1941, he issued Directive 39. The fanatical will to defend the ground on which the troops are standing must be injected into the troops with every possible means, even the toughest. 2 days later, he was more explicit. There will be no retreat. Every man will fight where he stands. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, protested. Hitler dismissed him. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, argued for tactical withdrawals. Hitler relieved him of command. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt requested permission to evacuate the Rostov salient. Hitler removed him. In 3 weeks, Hitler purged 35 senior officers. Anyone who suggested retreat was labeled a coward, a defeatist, a traitor to the Reich. And the soldiers stayed. They died in their frozen positions, but they stayed. What the German generals expected was military logic. They were professionals, men trained in the Prussian tradition that valued tactical flexibility, operational art, the calculated risk. They had studied Clausewitz, who wrote that defense is the stronger form of combat, not static defense, but elastic defense, trading space for time, preserving forces for counterattack. They had inherited the legacy of the German General Staff, which had nearly won the Great War through maneuver and operational brilliance. When Hitler ordered halt, they expected discussion, analysis, strategic assessment. They presented him with casualty figures. Army Group Center had lost 155,000 men in November alone, 20% of its strength. They showed him supply reports. Ammunition expenditure exceeded delivery by 40%. Fuel stocks sufficient for 1 week of operations. Winter clothing for less than half the troops. They explained that tactical retreat to the Dnieper River would shorten the front by hundreds of kilometers, allow for rest and refit, preserve combat power for spring offensives. Hitler listened and rejected everything. What they experienced instead was the will of a man who believed himself beyond military science. Hitler declared that fanatical will would overcome material deficiency, that holding at all costs was not merely tactic but philosophy, that every meter of Soviet soil cost German blood and must not be surrendered. He invoked Frederick the Great, who held against impossible odds in the 7 Years' War. He cited the belief that Stalin's reserves must be exhausted, that one more winter would break Soviet morale, that retreat would collapse into rout and rout into catastrophe. Most dangerously, he began to believe his own mythology. The victory in France had convinced him that his intuition surpassed his general's expertise. When they told him the Ardennes forest was impassable for tanks, he ordered the attack anyway, and France fell. When they said the invasion of Norway was too risky, he commanded it, and Denmark and Norway became German in a single day. Now, when they said withdraw or face destruction, he heard only the caution of men who lacked his vision, his willpower, his destiny. The generals faced an impossible choice: obey and watch their men die. Disobey and face court-martial, execution, the destruction of their families under Nazi terror. Some, like Guderian, accepted dismissal rather than comply. Most stayed and enforced orders they knew were insane. General Gotthard Heinrici, commanding 4th Army, received the no-retreat order while his divisions were being encircled near Moscow. He later wrote, "I felt as though I had been struck by a hammer. The troops were exhausted, frozen, decimated. To demand they hold without reserves, without winter equipment, without hope of reinforcement. It was murder disguised as duty." Yet Heinrici enforced the order. 4th Army lost 40,000 men in January alone, frozen in positions they could neither defend nor abandon. The Iron Cross that Oberleutnant Weber dropped in the snow was replicated 1,000,000 times across the Eastern Front. Small symbols of belief that fell into darkness as the men who carried them learned that their enemy was not merely the Red Army, but the inflexibility of their own command. The historical record preserves the cost with brutal clarity. In the winter of 1941-1942, Army Group Center lost approximately 400,000 men, more than the entire Wehrmacht casualties in the invasions of Poland, France, and the Balkans combined. Of these, fewer than half were combat losses. The remainder fell to frostbite, disease, exposure, exhaustion. Medical reports document 100,000 cases of severe frostbite requiring amputation. Thousands more simply froze to death in their foxholes, found weeks later still clutching their rifles. Private Hans Rudiger, a 22-year-old infantry soldier from Bavaria, kept a diary that survived him. His entry for January 15, 1942 reads, "We have been ordered to hold this village. I do not know its name. They all look the same, wooden houses and snow." Yesterday, Ernst lost 3 fingers to frostbite. Today, he shot himself. The Feldwebel recorded it as combat death, so his family will receive pension. We cannot bury him. The ground is frozen solid. We stack the bodies behind the barn like cordwood. At night, I dream of Munich, of beer gardens, of summer. I wake, and there is only snow, and the certainty we will not leave this place alive. Rudiger died on January 28th. His body was found in spring when the snow melted, still in his foxhole, still facing east. The Soviet counteroffensive drove the Wehrmacht back between 100 kilometers and 250 kilometers along the entire Moscow front. It was the first major German retreat of the war. Yet it could have been worse. Hitler's no-retreat order, for all its cost, did prevent the controlled withdrawal from collapsing into rout. Panic-stricken units held because officers threatened to shoot deserters. Isolated strongpoints tied down Soviet forces. The front stabilized not through strategic brilliance, but through the expenditure of men treated as ammunition, fired once and discarded. Hitler interpreted this as vindication. In his mind, fanatical will had saved the Wehrmacht from Napoleon's fate. He dismissed the fact that Soviet logistics were equally strained, that Zhukov's offensive exhausted itself, that German lines held not because of the no-retreat order, but despite it. The lesson Hitler learned was precisely wrong. That will could substitute for strategy, that losses didn't matter if ground was held, that generals who counseled retreat were cowards to be purged. This lesson would be applied again and again, each time with greater catastrophe. Stalingrad. Summer 1942. General Friedrich Paulus commanded the Sixth Army, the finest formation in the Wehrmacht, veterans of France and Barbarossa, 270,000 men advancing on the city that bore Stalin's name. By November, Sixth Army occupied 90% of Stalingrad. The Volga River lay just beyond reach. Then, Soviet Operation Uranus encircled the city, trapping Paulus and his entire army in a pocket 30 kilometers wide. Paulus requested permission to break out. His staff calculated they had fuel and ammunition for a fighting retreat lasting perhaps 4 days. After that, the army would be destroyed. But if they moved immediately, they could escape the encirclement, preserve the force, establish defensive lines on the Don River. Hitler refused. On November 22, 1942, he sent a direct order to Paulus. The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad to the last man and the last round. Supply will be provided by air. The Army's heroic stand will tie down Russian forces and allow for relief from outside. Every element of this order was fantasy. The Luftwaffe promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies per day, the minimum Sixth Army needed to survive. The actual average delivery was 94 tons per day. Men were rationed to 3 ounces of bread daily. Horses were slaughtered and eaten. The wounded froze to death in field hospitals without heat or medicine. By late December, Sixth Army was dying, not fighting and dying, but simply dying, too weak to resist, too entrapped to escape. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein organized a relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, that fought to within 30 kilometers of the pocket in December. He sent word to Paulus, "Break out now. Fight toward the relief force. There is a narrow window to escape." Paulus refused. Hitler had forbidden breakout. Paulus would not disobey. The relief force was driven back. The window closed. On January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered, the first German field marshal ever to surrender in battle. Of the 270,000 men encircled at Stalingrad, 91,000 marched into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The iron crosses they carried were left behind in the frozen ruins. The pattern repeated with mechanical inevitability. Tunisia, 1943. 250,000 German and Italian troops trapped by Allied advances. Generals requested evacuation to Sicily to preserve trained forces. Hitler ordered them to hold. They surrendered in May. Korsun, Cherkasy, Ukraine, January 1944. 2 German corps encircled by Soviet forces. Hitler forbade breakout until it was nearly too late. When he finally relented, 30,000 men had to abandon all heavy equipment and fight their way out on foot through frozen marshes. Losses: 20,000 killed, captured, or missing. Normandy, summer 1944. After D-Day, the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were compressed into the Falaise Pocket by American, British, and Canadian forces. A narrow corridor remained for retreat. Generals pleaded to withdraw through the gap before it closed. Hitler insisted they counterattack, drive to the sea, split the Allied armies. The counterattack failed. The pocket closed. 50,000 Germans captured, 10,000 killed, an entire army group shattered. General Gunther von Kluge, commander of Army Group B, wrote a final letter to Hitler before taking cyanide. "When you receive this, I shall be no more. I'm taking my own life because I refuse to preside over the destruction of the German army through orders I know to be militarily insane." By 1944, the no-retreat doctrine had evolved from crisis response to operational suicide. German armies were repeatedly encircled because they lacked permission to conduct mobile defense. They could not trade space for time. They could not execute tactical withdrawals. Every position had to be held to the last man, which meant that when positions were overrun, and they always were eventually, entire formations were lost rather than portions of them. The Soviet concept of deep operations, multiple echelons punching through German lines, then exploiting deep into rear areas, was devastatingly effective against an enemy forbidden to maneuver. American operational mobility overwhelmed German forces ordered to defend static lines. By insisting on holding everywhere, Hitler ensured defense nowhere. Statistical analysis is damning. German military casualties from June 1941 to May 1945, approximately 4.2 million killed, 1.8 million missing, and presumed dead. Of these, more than 3 million occurred after January 1943, after Stalingrad, after the no-retreat doctrine was fully institutionalized. German historians have estimated that tactical flexibility, the freedom to conduct mobile defense, withdraw from untenable positions, preserve forces for counterattack, could have reduced losses by as much as 30%. That represents nearly 1 million men who died because retreat was forbidden. But statistics cannot capture what was lost beyond bodies. The Wehrmacht that invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 was a professional military with institutional knowledge, tactical expertise, leadership continuity. By 1943, that army was gone, not merely defeated, but consumed. Junior officers promoted to command battalions because all the majors were dead. 17-year-old boys conscripted to fill divisions. Training reduced from months to weeks. Equipment decrepit, morale shattered, logistics collapsed. The no-retreat order accelerated this destruction. It prevented the gradual, controlled contraction that might have allowed Germany to stabilize defensive lines, preserve trained cadres, husband resources. Instead, it demanded total commitment to every position, resulting in total loss when those positions fell. The transformation occurred not merely in battlefield outcomes, but in the minds of the men who survived. German soldiers who entered the Soviet Union in 1941 carried a belief, perhaps misguided, certainly arrogant, but genuine, that they fought for civilization against Bolshevism, for Germany's rightful place in the world, for ideals worth dying for. The Iron Cross symbolized that belief: duty, honor, sacrifice in service to something greater. By 1943, that belief had curdled into bitter resignation. Soldiers no longer fought for victory but for survival. They obeyed orders not from conviction but from terror of military police who hanged deserters from lampposts. They held positions not to achieve strategic objectives but because retreat meant court-martial. The Iron Cross became a hollow symbol, metal stamped with words that had lost meaning. Lieutenant Heinrich von Einsiedel, captured at Stalingrad, later wrote, "We realized too late that we were not fighting for Germany but for Hitler's ego, that our lives were expendable tokens in his refusal to admit error, that the no-retreat order was not military strategy but psychological pathology, a madman's inability to accept reality. We who survived carry guilt not for what we did, but for obeying when we should have refused." This was the true cost, the corruption of duty into complicity. German officers were trained that obedience to lawful orders was sacred duty. But what is duty when orders are insane? What is honor when honor demands dishonor? The no-retreat doctrine forced officers to choose between betraying their men or betraying their oath. Most chose the oath. Their men died. Some resisted. General Hans von Salmuth, commanding Second Army in Ukraine, received a no-retreat order in March 1944, while Soviet forces surrounded his positions. He ignored it, ordered a fighting withdrawal, saved 40,000 men from encirclement. Hitler relieved him of command. But Second Army survived. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, operations officer for the Reserve Army, watched the carnage and concluded that Hitler must be removed, not merely replaced, but killed if Germany was to survive. On July 20, 1944, Stauffenberg placed a bomb beneath Hitler's conference table. It exploded. Hitler survived. Stauffenberg was executed that night. In the purge that followed, 7,000 people were arrested, 4,980 executed. Among them were field marshals, generals, colonels who had expressed doubts about Hitler's strategy. The message was absolute: obedience or death. By 1945, the Wehrmacht was a ghost army. Divisions existed on paper but fielded battalion strength. Boys and old men held trenches with rifles but no ammunition. Tiger tanks sat immobile for lack of fuel. And still, the no-retreat order remained in force. Berlin, April 1945. Hitler ordered the Ninth Army to hold the Seelow Heights, prevent Soviet approach to the capital. The Ninth Army was destroyed in 3 days. Hitler ordered the 12th Army to relieve Berlin. The 12th Army was overrun before reaching the city. Hitler, in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, still issued orders to armies that no longer existed, demanding counterattacks by divisions that were corpses. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself. 7 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Iron Crosses were collected from rubble and bodies, melted down, forgotten. There is a photograph taken by Soviet forces in February 1943 during the mopping-up operations at Stalingrad. It shows a German soldier frozen in his foxhole, half buried in snow. His hand extends upward, fingers curled around empty air, as if reaching for something. On the ground beside him lies a small iron cross, half covered by frost. Historians cannot identify the soldier. No unit markings survived. No papers remained legible. He is one of tens of thousands simply listed as missing. a category that conceals the reality of men who died alone, frozen, forgotten, far from home, obeying orders that should never have been given. The Iron Cross in the photograph is symbolic beyond its material form. It represents the promise made to German soldiers that their service mattered, that their sacrifice was meaningful, that their duty was to something noble. The no-retreat order transformed that promise into a lie. It demanded sacrifice without purpose, duty without reason, obedience unto annihilation. In the end, what Hitler's refusal to retreat revealed was not strength, but weakness, the weakness of a man who could not admit error, could not adapt to reality, could not value lives over ego. The generals who enforced his orders revealed their own weakness, the inability to place moral duty above military obedience, to say no when no was the only honorable response. The millions who died did not die gloriously. They died cold, hungry, frightened, and betrayed by leadership that valued symbols over soldiers, ideology over intelligence, pride over prudence. The Eastern Front, that vast frozen graveyard stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, consumed more lives than any military campaign in human history. 8 million German soldiers served there. 3 million never returned. The numbers are so vast they become abstract, incomprehensible. But each was a man. Each carried an iron cross or a photograph or a letter from home. Each believed, at least initially, in something. What did that sacrifice achieve? Germany lost the war. Lost it absolutely, unconditionally, with its cities in ruins, its army destroyed, its territory occupied, its government abolished. The no-retreat order did not save Germany. It accelerated its destruction by preventing the rational conduct of defense, by squandering irreplaceable military assets, by reducing strategic flexibility to zero. And yet Hitler insisted until the end that he had been right. In his final testament, dictated hours before his suicide, he wrote, "I demanded fanatical resistance because only fanaticism can overcome material disadvantage. That Germany ultimately fell is the fault not of my strategy, but of the German people's insufficient will." Even in death, he blamed everyone but himself. This is the final obscenity, the refusal to accept responsibility for the consequences of his own orders. The millions of frozen bodies were not failures of will. They were victims of willfulness, the willfulness of a dictator who could not distinguish between determination and delusion. There is a military cemetery near Volgograd, the city once called Stalingrad. It contains 40,000 German graves. The headstones are simple, uniform, marked only with names and dates. Many read simply, "Ein deutscher Soldat," a German soldier, unknown, unidentified. The ground was so frozen when they died that their bodies lay preserved in ice for months before burial became possible. Their iron crosses, if they had them, are gone. Looted, lost, irrelevant. Visitors to the cemetery often ask why these men are buried with such dignity, such care, given what they fought for. The answer is complex. They fought for an evil regime. Many committed or witnessed atrocities. Their cause was unjust. And yet they were also men trapped in a machinery of obedience that demanded everything and granted nothing. Not victory, not survival, not even the dignity of dying well. The no-retreat order is their monument, not in stone but in absence, in the lives that should have been lived and were not, in the children never born, in the decades stolen by a madman's pride. Modern military doctrine teaches flexibility. American Army operational manuals emphasize mission command. Commanders at every level empowered to adapt to battlefield conditions, to seize opportunities, to withdraw when necessary, always oriented toward the mission rather than rigid adherence to orders. Israeli Defense Forces teach tactical genius, the expectation that junior officers will exercise initiative, even contradict orders if they see a better path. The British Army values intelligent disobedience, the principle that an order causing more harm than good should be questioned and, if necessary, refused. These doctrines exist because military professionals studied what happened when they did not. They studied Stalingrad. They studied the Falaise Pocket. They studied the litany of German disasters that resulted when armies became straitjackets, when retreat was forbidden, when obedience superseded reason. The lesson is not merely tactical, it is moral. No order is legitimate if it demands pointless death. No duty is sacred if it requires complicity in mass murder. No obedience is honorable if it serves madness. The German generals of 1941-1945 failed that test. Some out of fear, some out of ambition, some out of conditioning that made refusal unthinkable. Their failure was human, understandable, and inexcusable. There is one final image worth contemplating. In the winter of 1942, as the Wehrmacht struggled to hold its positions outside Moscow, a young German soldier, name unknown, unit unknown, carved into the wall of a bunker, "Wer dies liest ist zu weit gegangen." Whoever reads this has gone too far. It was discovered by Soviet forces in January, photographed, preserved in archives in Moscow. The carving remains visible today. It is the epitaph of an army that marched too far, stayed too long, and died because retreat was forbidden. It is the warning of a man who understood, perhaps in his final days, that distance can be measured not only in kilometers, but in decisions. Each decision to obey rather than resist, to follow rather than question, to serve ideology rather than humanity. Whoever reads this has gone too far. The Wehrmacht went too far into Russia, too far into obedience, too far into the abyss of a war that could not be won. And when the order came to hold, to die in place rather than live to fight, it had already gone too far to turn back. The iron crosses lie beneath the snow of 1,000 forgotten battlefields. They mark not valor, but tragedy. The tragedy of millions who obeyed when they should have refused, who stayed when they should have fled, who died because one man could not admit he was wrong. The true retreat was moral, not tactical. The true defeat was choosing obedience over conscience. In the end, that is what the no-retreat order cost. Not merely millions of lives, but the corruption of duty itself, the transformation of honor into horror, the revelation that orders demanding evil are not orders at all. They are crimes, and those who enforce them are not soldiers, but executioners. The snow has long since melted. The bodies have long since decayed. The iron crosses have rusted into nothing. But the lesson remains, carved into history, as surely as that unknown soldier carved his warning into frozen concrete. Whoever reads this has gone too far. Let us read and retreat from the madness of absolute obedience. Let us remember the millions who could not, and honor them not by repeating their tragedy but by refusing to follow leaders who demand it. That is the only victory left to claim from the frozen graves of the Eastern Front.